Hi everyone, and a big welcome to those joining us this lunchtime for a roundtable event that's going to close Poverty Alliance's conference. And we're bringing together today a huge wealth of experience and knowledge that's going to help us look in depth at how we address issues of inequality as we move forward during and through to the other side of this global pandemic. So I'm Karin Goodwin. I'm a journalist specialising in social affairs, and also a co-editor of the Ferret investigations website. My work also involves some community journalism and consultancy with projects from migrant rights to community participation in local decision making. So just a couple of things before we get started. We're using a hashtag today, which is Challenge Poverty. So do get involved in that and share the ideas that are coming up today far and wide. And you can also add your questions there with the Q&A little box down at the bottom, and Peter will pick those up and bring them to our attention as we move through. So in the morning, we heard from community activists with experience of living with poverty about the impact that all of this has had on them and their communities. Other workshops have looked at the labour market, social security system, and highlighted various challenges that have been exacerbated by the crisis. So the emphasis on this discussion at this roundtable is to consider where all of this leaves us. What are the prospects for social change now? It can be easy to feel quite hopeless in the face of all this challenge. There's so much that we're up against right now. But the aim here is to look at how we find our way through all of this to a more equal Scotland. As the Edinburgh Poverty Commission report published last week stressed, poverty is not inevitable. So to help us unpick some of these difficult questions, we're lucky to have a really fantastic panel that I'll introduce just now. We've first of all got Sabir Zazai, who was appointed as Chief Executive of Scottish Refugee Council in September 2017. He arrived in the UK as an asylum seeker in 1999, fleeing conflict in Afghanistan. He was dispersed by the Home Office to Coventry and got involved in community initiatives. And then from 2014, led the Coventry Refugee and Migrant Centre, a charity that actually helped his own journey as a refugee. He's got a wealth of knowledge in refugee integration that's informed by his personal experience and his research. He was recently conferred with an honorary doctorate from the University of Glasgow for his services to the community. We've also got joining us today Mary Senior, who is currently Vice President of the Scottish Trade Union Congress. In her day job, she's also very busy as the Scotland official for University and College Union, UCU, the trade union representing over 100,000 academic and related members across the UK. Mary leads the union's bargaining, campaigning and organising work in Scotland, including work to eradicate casual work contracts from the university sector. We've also got Katherine Trebeck here with us, who's the advocacy and influencing lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and who considers herself a political economist, I think, Katherine, you've said. Her background includes 8 years in various roles with Oxfam, including with Oxfam Scotland. She's on a huge range of advisory boards looking at a wealth of issues around economic democracy and sustainability. She has a PhD in political science and is an honorary professor at the University West of Scotland and a senior visiting researcher at the University of Strathclyde. Her book, The Economics of Arrival, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy, was published in early 2019. And finally, we've got Julia Unwin joining us. She was the Chief Executive of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust from 2007 until the end of 2016. She's a member of the Housing Corporation Board for 10 years and a Charity Commissioner from 1998 until 2003. She chaired the Refugee Council in the late 1990s and was also a deputy chair of the Food Standard Agency. She's an independent consultant and operating with the government, voluntary and corporate sectors. She was the chair of the Independent Inquiry on the Future of Civil Society and was appointed at the Council of Economic Advisers by the First Minister of Scotland and a member of the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, which reported in June 2020. So a huge range of experiences to draw on there. To turn to the issue that we're here to discuss, we've gone through all of this challenge we've met already so far in the pandemic. So we're now looking at what prospects we have for social change. I suppose all of you probably have felt that in the early phase of this pandemic, I don't know, possibly sort of driven by a sense of panic, there was a real sense of people pulling together at the same time, of solidarity, of community cohesion forming. And there was also some intervention in terms of the economy and social security systems. Fast forward now to this point in time, and I'm wondering if this early promise has kind of what change there is in terms of the redesign of our social and economic systems, and how can that be maintained? So I suppose I'd quite like to turn to Katherine first and ask if you can tell us a little bit about, despite all the horror, could there be in some way a time that we're seeing conditions developing for social change? How do you feel about that, Katherine?
Thanks, Karen, and really lovely to be part of this conversation with fellow panelists, and congratulations to everyone at the Poverty Alliance for yet another amazing Challenge Poverty Week, really, and just incredible effort yet again. And in terms of the question around, I guess, really, is the pandemic going to bring about the structural shift that we so urgently need in our economy? I will confess to having been wrong just a few months ago, even prior to the COVID crisis hitting. I remember waking up in early January, watching the news from back home in Australia, watching my country burn up. And I thought the magnitude of those bushfires would bring about the political awakening that was so urgently needed in Australia. And I really thought that bushfire crisis hit every part of Australia's society. It hit the rich and poor, people really mobilizing around it. Scientists were saying this is due to climate change. And I thought that confluence of events and the magnitude of it would really turn around minds in the corridors of power. And of course, I was profoundly wrong. So take what I'm about to say with that grain of salt. But I do think there is something about this idea that, you know, political scientists talk about, this idea of the Overton window, that when public attention moves into a space, then politicians will start to respond. And if we can shift that public mind, then you get political action. And what we've seen in the last few months is the smashing wide open of the Overton window. We've seen policies being enacted that even 6 months ago would have been dismissed as naive or politically infeasible and unrealistic. We're seeing mobilization of arms of government, decisions being taken so quickly that we couldn't have imagined this before. So ways of working and just the magnitude of, as you've already said, Karen, intervention in the economy is extraordinary. And I think we're seeing some really good precedents where if we can hold on, they might bode well for new ways of doing things. One really good example, I think, is the conditionality conversation around bailouts of various companies. I don't think that's nearly bold enough, particularly from UK government, but at least here in Scotland, we've had a discussion about, is it okay for public funds to go to companies that are using tax havens? Of course, Denmark was really first out of the blocks in that conversation. We had the UN General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, say that no company should get public money if it doesn't have a plan to meet the Paris Climate Accord. And that conversation needs to carry on. We need to have much higher expectations of what businesses do, how they perform, what the activities they have, the impact they have, if they're going to put their hand up for government funding. The other aspect I think is hopeful is this heightened appreciation of local economies. In terms of our just provisioning for our basic needs, it's been the local grocery store that has kept going, often in quite real danger to people working behind the counter. It's those supply chains that have held up. And I think if we can really carry on that appreciation of local provision, we'll have a chance at redesigning our economies from the local up. And we've seen this heightened discussion around community wealth building. And then the other aspect I think that does give me hope is just what has kept communities going has been just the basic compassion and solidarity and empathy of the gift economy, supporting our neighbours, our friends, people we may not have even known before, but just being there for them. And of course, none of that will get counted in our GDP figures. And yet, so if we're trying to measure the recovery in inverted commas, whether it's V-shaped or U-shaped, we won't capture so many of those really important aspects of life that keep people going. Having said that, I think there are other days when you hear the voices of just clamoring for a return to how things were that are very, very powerful, reaching for I'd say, outdated recipes, prescriptions for how to do the policy that have time and time again proved themselves inadequate. And I really worry that just how firm those voices are and how loud they are in the ears of politicians. So I think it's all to play for. We've got a task on our hands to really point to the sort of activities that we want to see more of in the economy. But it's on a knife edge, I'd say.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katherine. So, Mary, on a knife edge, you heard Katherine talking there about how wellbeing won't be measured in terms of GDPR. It's also not measured in terms of how it pays the rent. Do you want to tell me a little bit about, you know, how you're looking at from a worker's perspective, as a trade union perspective, whether there are kind of ways in which we can push for social change right now?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I'd also like to echo Katherine. It's really good to be here, and also just to clarify that I think it's Julia is the ennobled person here, not me. Just to say, you know, I think we knew that the economy wasn't working before the pandemic hit. You know, we'd had a decade of austerity, but even before then, you know, we had the conditions that the economy wasn't working for all of the people in Scotland and in the UK as a whole. We had, you know, tremendous inequalities that had been increasing and really got to breaking point over the last couple of years. And I think what the pandemic has done has really exposed these economic failings and exposed the weakness of capitalism. So I think what we saw in March and April and in those early months was our economy's reliance on low-paid key workers in care homes, in the NHS, in supermarkets, in the transport system, people on incredibly low pay, precarious contracts, but you know, they were the people keeping our economy going, and they were the people trying their very best to look after our elderly and vulnerable and to help people recover. But I think it was tremendously difficult. I mean, we had the challenges around PPE because we didn't have an economy in Scotland and in the UK that had fostered manufacturing locally. And I think Katherine's point about local economies was so important. You know, 20 years ago, I was a very young trade unionist with the GMB, and the GMB union represented workers in knitwear in the Borders. There was, you know, a bra factory in Greenock. There were jeans factories in Dundee. These were all places that could have been producing PPE, but, you know, those jobs were offshored a long time ago. So, you know, I think we saw that the economy wasn't working, and successive governments had allowed that to happen. So for the STUC and the trade union movement now, you know, we're trying to look at that and trying to ensure that we don't go back to the past, but we build better. And I think it's about, you know, valuing workers, giving an immediate uplift to pay to those key workers, and giving them the protection that they need. And, you know, I think we also saw the role of an interventionist government being so important, because in those early stages of the pandemic, it really was only government that could intervene to provide the resources and the funding to, you know, to support people. So I guess back to your earlier question, you know, I think the pandemic has, in a way, helped to create this sense that things need to change. But like Katherine, I worry that other voices are getting louder and there is a desire to go back to the past. I sort of worry people have got short memories as well. I mean, you know, we clapped every Thursday for key workers. You know, are we all now supporting a £2 pay uplift an hour for key workers? I'm not as clear that's happening. So, you know, so I worry we might lose it. One of the other, I think, helpful things around the pandemic too was a renewed focus on experts. I think it was worrying in the past number of years, the rise of populism and a sort of critique of a sort of metropolitan elite, that was really damaging to people who were expert in their field and were presenting evidence to sort of back up their points. And I think in some respects, I think the pandemic has led us to show that we actually need experts, and they've got a vital role to play in our society and our economy. Okay, thanks a lot for that, Mary. Sabir, I'm interested in your thoughts as we think about the important role of an interventionist government, you know, about their kind of, about the concerns about things being missed. You're obviously in from your sector and from the people that you're working with, in a particularly challenging time just now with the rhetoric that you're facing. How hopeful are you feeling about this as an opportunity for social change, and what really are you up against at the moment?
Thanks, Karin. I too am delighted to be here with colleagues, and really pleased to be invited to be part of this really helpful conversation and to learn from others' perspective. I think in terms of measuring a society's success, I think a society is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. And unfortunately, where we are within the pandemic, but well before it as well, there has been intentional policies that could be seen as state violence against people who are simply seeking protection here. And these are people who are fleeing poverty, who are fleeing war, conflict, like myself and many others, but also looking to rebuild their lives here in safety and dignity and make a contribution. So we are in a time of great social, economic and political and technological change in which our values, virtues and practices will be reshaped. But at the same time, we've got sadly a very strong right-wing rhetoric simply about the people who are arriving and seeking protection here. And it's because of the societal changes, such as people fleeing conflicts, but also more specifically, if you look locally, food poverty, financial insecurity, and low incomes have always called for a process of social renewal, but more importantly, a process of reimagining our society. What sort of society do we want to be? And that must draw us to our history. And I think history is very important in this. We've always been a welcoming nation. We've always been proud of our hospitality and sanctuary we've provided to those in really difficult times that need protection here. And culture is also very important. But sadly, whilst we're dealing with the pandemic, whilst we are responding to the crisis, we're having a go at our history and culture and things that we need for the process of reimagination or social renewal. These are the building blocks. And we cannot have a process of social renewal or social change without looking into our values and virtues. So to build something greater, what we need is, we don't need the small changes that have been introduced. £20 universal credit, 21 pence a day to refugees, people seeking protection, 21 pence increase in their support. These are very small changes. We need greater things than that. We need we need something much bigger, and that much bigger thing is hope and recovery of our economic courage, but also more importantly, reevaluation of our economic and finance-based values. How do we treat the most vulnerable in our society? And those are the sort of questions we need to grapple with if we are really sincere about a process of social change and reimagination as we emerge out of this crisis.
Thanks a lot, Sabir. It's really interesting talking about, you know, those tiny changes, as you say, 21 pence, £20 versus the need that I think we all in this virtual room are looking at in terms of real social change towards equality. And Julia, I hope to bring you in at this point just to look at, you know, what you make of all this, how we then take where we are just now and look at how we reimagine and begin to push for that change. How do we make use of any opportunity that we have at this particular point to move forward productively?
Well, thank you. And thank you to fellow speakers. I mean, such interesting presentations. We could be talking for hours. And thank you to Poverty Alliance. Fantastic to pull a conference of this scale and this depth of thinking together at this time, I think is a real achievement. I think the pandemic has accelerated things that were happening anyway and has laid bare some of the most difficult challenges we face. And it shouldn't have been a surprise. We knew that this decade would be a decade of shocks. Katherine talked about Australia. Where I live in Yorkshire, people are still not rehoused from the floods early in the year. Imagine living through a pandemic and not being properly housed. We expected cybercrime, we expected all sorts of levels of attack, and we knew we were facing huge economic volatility. On top of this, we've had a horrific pandemic, which has damaged the lives of everybody in the UK. But it's damaged people's lives differently. It has exposed these massive differences. There was this appalling thing said at the beginning, we're all in it together. You know, we're all in the same place. We are all in very different places. A new class division has emerged across the UK of those of us who can work from home and those of us who can only work if we go to supermarkets or go out as care workers, supermarket workers, or working in cafes, and are therefore so much more at risk. So the death rate has been differential. We've been divided on grounds of ethnicity, we've been divided on grounds of income, we've been divided about where we live. I think we face a real crisis. There was, as I think both Katherine and Mary said, an amazing moment at the beginning of sense of agency, sense of power, sense we could do things. And that's true after natural disasters. I've spent a lot of time reading recently about natural disasters. After a volcano or an earthquake, people think we can do stuff. You then end up in this long demoralised phase where we, I think, across the UK are lacking the sort of leadership we need. But we learned some things that really matter and we need to bank those. We've learned that it's communities that help each other, that there is a real sense of social solidarity that gets tired and gets weary, but it's really there when we're not being told to inform on our neighbours, which seems to be the best way of breaking up social solidarity. We know that people really did go out of their way to help and to do things. We know that a state can intervene and protect jobs. But I think we risk a time of real division. We risk being distracted by these ludicrous cultural wars, which are not real and not rooted in people's lived experience. And we risk, as somebody's put in the chat room, the growth of austerity to pay for all this. Goodness sake, this is the country that in 1945 invested in building new structures after a cataclysmic crisis. We've got to be able to do something better here out of this. And I think some of what Scotland is doing is part of it. Forgive me, there's a massive storm in Yorkshire and it's just belting into my window. I'm trying to speak above it. So I think there is scope for change, but there's also real risk at the moment. I think we are on the precipice. And I think Poverty Alliance, some of the amazing things that the Scottish Government has said, the wellbeing economy, are all ways that you can show the rest of the UK a better way of doing business. But we are at some risk and we shouldn't pretend we're not.
Okay, fantastic. So what it sounds to me, I think for a lot of us just now, I certainly can include myself, and I wonder if you all feel like this, but there's a feeling of being overwhelmed sometimes. I mean, all of you could, and I'm sure this morning, so many activists were talking about so many ways in which the challenges are kind of really very looming at the moment. And so it sounds to me, Julia, that you're saying that really the people we need to be listening to most closely are communities themselves. I wonder how people think we can maybe action that and bring those voices that matter to the fore. What do we prioritise here? How do we avoid that feeling of being overwhelmed? Maybe Mary, you could tell me, as someone kind of dealing with crisis on multiple fronts at the moment, how we do that. Yeah, no, I think I suppose that's an enormous
question, Karin. And I mean, I think for trade unionists, obviously a key priority for us was keeping our members and citizens generally safe, and I think that has had to be a major priority for the trade union movement throughout this pandemic. So, you know, a focusing on keeping people safe now, but how we keep them safe in the future. I guess the other aspect certainly for trade unions is to keep people in work, or I guess one of the beauties of the furlough scheme was that people were still receiving an income and they weren't being thrown into unemployment, whilst clearly some economic activity couldn't be happening because of the safety issues. So, you know, I think keeping people in work, but importantly, ensuring that they have a living wage, a real living wage, you know, has been so vital. I suppose an interesting thing that I'd really like to throw in is around digital inclusion. And, you know, I think this time last year, or a month or so on, you know, we had the proposal of free broadband, and everyone laughed and everyone said, you know, that's pie in the sky. But, you know, 6 months later, I was sitting in meetings with the Scottish Government, particularly about college and university students and community learning, and recognising that the provision of broadband across communities was so vital to keep people engaged, keep people together. And, you know, the new platforms of working have, I think, really been quite empowering and inspiring to people, but you can only be there if you actually have access to them. So I do think looking at things around digital inclusion, and also regulation for things like automation and data and so on, I think there's real dangers that we're sharing so much information via the internet and other technical means, but do we always understand what's happening to our data, and are less scrupulous people, you know, I think it's about power again, and I guess we know the stuff around the Facebooks and the Googles and so on. So, you know, for me, trying to address digital inclusion and digital and data security, whilst I guess it sounds a wee bit nerdy, I think it has to be on the agenda for you know, progressive campaigners and anti-poverty campaigners.
Fantastic. Sabir, I wonder if I could bring you in here. We're talking about digital inclusion, and we're talking about living wage, and for a lot of people that you're working with.
Sabir, can you still hear us?
Yeah, I can hear. I think we lost Karin.
Have a go at what she was maybe going to say around the folks you're working with in digital inclusion.
Yeah, I think there's a range of things that we have been picking up through our work that is making life even more challenging for those seeking protection against the backdrop of the pandemic. There were a number of issues that people we work with, or people who are seeking protection here, were facing before the pandemic. So there were a range of injustices that the asylum system is built on. For example, people are not allowed to work whilst they're going through the asylum system. People have to survive on £35 a week when they are in that system. And also, sadly, over 300 people living in some form of supported accommodation in Glasgow were then moved to hotels in the centre of Glasgow. I think what I'm coming at in terms of this is that digital poverty, food poverty, social exclusion, these are sort of things that the asylum system is built upon. I know we might be saying, what about the wider society? But this in itself, the way the asylum system is set up, is bringing a degree of social and economic impoverishment to all of us, because we've got this community. These are people who will be our neighbours, will be our colleagues, and will be our friends in the future. If they don't do well, we all don't do well. And if they prosper, we all prosper. So sadly, there has been a situation where there are certain things where if they have no recourse to public funds, they're not entitled to those. And again, no recourse to public funds, another state-driven violence in a way where we all need to have some form of support or a safety net. But sadly, there has been instances where if people get to a certain part of the asylum process, then no recourse to public funds does not only put them at financial disadvantage, but sadly, as some of you might have noticed, it leads to some really sad tragedies as well.
And are there solutions there that, you know, even that we can be calling for here in Scotland, Sabir? I mean, we obviously often talk about Westminster's role in that, but are there some clear solutions that we can push for, having seen this exposed through, as you say, some really tragic situations?
Yeah, that's what I'm coming at, is that if we're talking about real meaningful social change and social renewal, then we need to have some radical policy approaches and ideas as well. We cannot have change happen for the most vulnerable without policy change, without changing the bedrock of our legislative systems. I think there needs to be for poverty to be eradicated, what we need is legislative change at a high level, so that all communities, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their status, are given that equal support and what our society has to offer. I think one point I want to go back to in terms of the generosity of the communities in response to this crisis, we have seen quite a lot of, we've seen a real revolution of generosity from members of the public towards those seeking protection. The fact that we reach out to one another in a moment of real crisis, I think it just signifies that we're a caring society. But does our policy speak to those values that people are expressing on a daily basis as they welcome their new neighbours and new friends and new Scots? I think one thing that stood out to me in this crisis in terms of that point and the public's generosity was the act of Captain Sir Tom Moore. But again, why don't we have similar acts from the most wealthy in our society? And he went that distance to raise that amount for NHS. What about our wealthy? Why don't we have a clear, just and fair distribution of wealth? And we see every day in our charitable giving and donations towards refugees and others that the poor, based on a percentage of their wealth, their income, not wealth. I don't think men will have wealth. They give more as opposed to the rich. I think I'm not again drawing a comparison here in any sense, but I think if we all we say we're all in it together, but we all have to pull together as well when it comes to these crises.
Fantastic. Picking up on that point about pulling together, I'll come to Katherine and then back to Julia, if that's okay. Just how do we then, given all these very different experiences and fights that we're fighting, the feeling of being overwhelmed, pull together to really make the most of this Overton window, if it is that, you know, of the push for the uplift of everybody in society? Katherine,
before I come to that, can I just build on a couple of points that Sabir made there, and a couple of points, just picking up the point around Sir Tom Moore. I mean, I think I found it really mixed feelings for his work, because I mean, I'd love to sit down and have a chat with him, a sweet guy. But to me, having the word NHS and charity in the same phrase is just not acceptable in a country like the UK. We shouldn't be raising charity for our National Health Service. And I think your point around greed is so well made, because, and I think this is one of the questions for for civil society, I mean, we have to keep holding this conversation that the existence of poverty and destitution, as you've so powerfully outlined, Sabir, is about distribution. And there was research out just yesterday, and this is global figures, but there will be equivalents in Scotland, that the wealth of billionaires has gone up during the pandemic by 27%. So these are not questions of scarcity. These are questions of distribution and how we as society, as collective organisations, choose to share our resources. And so to me, yeah, the fact that we're even, people raising money for NHS charity, as I think is just a dire indictment about that maldistribution, that some people are not paying enough. And it was great to see a brilliant tweet from Poverty Alliance this morning around the conversation around windfall taxes and wealth taxes, because there will be a lot of people, probably myself included, who, as Julia said, we're lucky enough to work from our kitchen tables rather than have to be forced to deliver to the kitchen tables, not spending as much. So our savings will go up. This is why people are talking about, a K-shaped recovery, where a whole chunk of people are just plateauing along the lines, and others' wealth is going up. We need to have that conversation about distribution. There's also a question around how the magnitude of the change that's required, and I think again, Sabir, you made this point, just tweaking around the system is not okay. And there's a lovely observation being made that a time of revolutions, of which we are most certainly in right now, is a moment for revolutions, not for patching. And those words were written by William Beveridge in 1942 on the front pages of the document that laid the groundwork for the construction of the NHS and the National Health Service. And so we need collectively to raise our gaze. Yes, we need to help people survive. This is a humanitarian response that's required now. That the term Build Back Better came from the humanitarian sector. So its aptness right now is heartbreakingly appropriate. But we need to help people survive and cope today. But we also need to raise our gaze to what I'd describe as system change, the other SC. So survival and coping is one aspect of the wellbeing agenda. The other is system change. And that does require really thinking about the enormous questions of distribution, how wealth is created, who gets it, how much people are allowed to hold on to. And I think there's a shift in mentality too around values, as we've already discussed. I mean, we saw at the very beginning of lockdown back in March, how suddenly our society found a way to provide shelter for homeless people. Now, the irksome thing about that, it wasn't because they mattered as humans in and of themselves. It was because they were worried about being a danger to other people. It was an instrumental rather than a humanitarian response. And so we need to really roll out that compassion to it, so it extends to everyone, and see that it's not okay to let people survive on 21 cent pence a day. It's just extraordinary. In terms of moving together, I do think there is a risk around splintering and focusing on individual projects and individual policy demands. And I think that civil society is at its best when it has each other's backs, when it piles in on broad shared goals, recognizing that there are core principles that unite so many organizations fighting for social justice issues, and that we should really pile in to support each other's work, share resources rather than splintering over the differences. But also just say there's something about really taking care of ourselves, because this is extraordinarily tiring and exhausting in the hardest of circumstances. And when you're pushing up against the system bites back. And we've seen this. I can share examples and share some scars. But there's a wonderful phrase from Audre Lorde, who's been described as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. And she says that caring for herself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And so I guess the way we will get through this is also taking time to look after ourselves and look after each other, and really just support each other get through this enormous multi-layered challenge. Because if we ourselves as civil society burn out, then we won't be able to support anyone.
That's really interesting, Katherine. I think we could all take that point about self-care as an act of political warfare to heart right now. I think certainly it resonates with me. Julia, to come over to you, how do we turn this rhetoric around wealth redistribution. Do you agree that that's a key aspect in all of this? And how do we make that rhetoric into action rather than just...
Well, we're at risk, aren't we, of all just loudly agreeing with each other. So I'll try and put a different spin on it. But of course, we need fundamental change. The risk is always that we want fundamental change so we don't address the things that can be addressed immediately. One of the things I think we've learned in this pandemic is how fragile our institutions are and how a political culture of efficiency has made all our institutions so weak. So when we're told that we have to save the NHS because there's a pandemic, what you know is it operates at 98% efficiency. That's dangerous, that's appalling. All of our institutions do, the cull of charitable organisations, long established bodies having to lose staff because they were told that the only way to operate was at maximum heat all the time. What can you do when there's a crisis? You have no more to give. And I think that's a really dangerous thing that's been exposed, is how at risk all of the institutions on which we depend have been. So we need to rethink those business models in the way that Katherine's described to build the resilience that we need, because this is not the last crisis. There are going to be more. I mean, everything we know about climate change means that we know there are going to be more crises. We know that more people are going to need to come to this country, which is why Sabir is so right. We need a much more just and fair and compassionate system. But I think we have to do that in really practical ways. I think we have to make sure that we are ready and fit for those challenges. We've clearly shown that we're not. I also think we have to be on our guard for being divided. I think we are at a time when we are divided in so many ways. And as civil society, we have to say we are deeply rooted in place. It's civil society that knows what is going on. It's civil society that knows where there are people crammed into overcrowded housing or working in factories where there's no protection from them at all. We need to listen really carefully to what's happening locally. And I think one of the besetting crimes of the way this pandemic has been led in the UK, I don't speak about Scottish government, is it hasn't listened to what's happening locally. And that's why we are failing so badly. So the great strength of civil society is it's rooted deeply in communities. It knows stuff that other people don't know. It is the best way of communicating. It's the best way of sharing our knowledge and our compassion and our kindness. And actually, it's being disempowered every day. So I think there are risks ahead. I do think the digital revolution is phenomenally important and phenomenally dangerous because it powers social movements that are progressive, that are caring and are supportive. And it also powers social movements that are regressive, divisive and conspiracy theory laden. So I really worry about what's happening there. I worry about what is called fake news, but I think is so much more deep than that. I think it's really damaging. But I think we have opportunity. And I think in Scotland, you have the chance to say that there will be no economic recovery without social renewal, that actually the costs and the waste of poverty in Scotland are holding back the growth of a new and different economy. And I think that's what the Edinburgh Commission reported last week and really made clear that poverty is a political choice and it's one we can't afford. It's wrong, but it's also one we can't afford because it's too hard for the economy.
Okay, thank you for that. We're getting quite a lot of questions coming in that I'd quite like to turn to. When you're talking about poverty being a political choice there, it seems a good time to go into a question about austerity and fears that, you know, we might find ourselves facing austerity again, and what some of the policies that we can be pushing for to protect ourselves might be. Mary, I wondered what you thought about those kind of policies. How do we protect against austerity? Are there things, you talked about a living wage, are there things like universal basic income that you might want to bring into this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the STUC last week launched its publication of People's Recovery, I think, which draws on so many of the issues that have been mentioned today. I think particularly around like regional and sectoral forums to provide like economic information and citizen and worker engagement. I also think sectoral collective bargaining to help push up pay is absolutely key, and you know, I know there have been recommendations around this prior to the pandemic, but you know, that's, you know, so important. also, you know, I do wonder if this is an opportunity for a new debate around tax. I mean, for, you know, centuries, you know, since biblical times, the tax collector is always the bad person. But I think what the pandemic has shown is that it's taxation that supports the NHS and our vital public services. And, you know, tax is actually a good, and I think we all need to try and develop a narrative around that, that is about contributing so that we all get what we need. And, you know, progressive taxation rather than tax evasion and tax avoidance has to be so important, so that we can all democratically share out that wealth, you know, in a better way, because, you know, it really does not have to be like that. You know, I think one of the issues that the STUC's People's Recovery says is that Scotland's 2 richest families now have as much wealth as the poorest 20% of the population. I think that just underlines the, you know, the huge disparity and inequity that's there. So I think certainly sort of reshaping the debate around taxation, that it isn't a bad thing. It actually it helps us all, that we've got an NHS that we can rely on, that we've got roads that are safe, that we've got lighting, that we've got schools, and that we've got staff in that essential infrastructure who are paid you know, a real decent living wage.
Fantastic. I wonder if just I could come back to you, Katherine, before I come to Sabir as well, because a lot of that talks to some of the points that you were raising earlier, and just ask the same question of you in terms of what policies might protect us from going back to austerity, from those political choices that were made in that time.
I think tax is absolutely vital, and the statistics Mary has just shared shows that there is no need, if we're brave and bold enough, to have a conversation about seeing where wealth exists and where wealth is being hoarded. But it's also not just about, I guess, the conversation around redistribution. There's also a discussion, I think, that's well overdue about asking the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. So we're not just letting the market run rampant and then generate these unequal outcomes in the first place, and then 5 o'clock in the afternoon turning to government saying, help us just marginally redistribute, and then patting ourselves on the back and, you know, giving ourselves our social justice, you know, badges for slightly redistributing. What we need to be doing is saying, why have the gap between rich and poor opened up so much in the first place? And that comes to questions around the nature of our businesses, how value that's created within firms is shared, how much of it goes up to pay dividends and to share prices of people who are 9 times out of 10, those are people who are earning rents from their wealth rather than working for, you know, and making more money from their rents than any of us here on this call could make in our day job. Having questions around maybe it's much more employee ownership, for example, so people who are creating that value get a share of it, and it's actually done with the purpose not to extract wealth away from them, but to generate wealth that's shared. Conversations around community wealth building are absolutely vital, because it's about generating economic activity from the community up and keeping it circulating through local multipliers, rather than just this old recipe of growing the economy faster and then crossing our fingers that some of it will trickle down to the communities that most need it. So these are big questions about a profound restructuring around ownership and the nature of the economy and our forms of business, that just, you know, to go back to Sabir's point, we cannot keep patching and tinkering and tweaking and hope that that will bring about revolutionary changes. We need to have these sorts of discussions. I would say I think there are very, very tentative steps in Scotland in the right direction that I think just need to be doubled down on rather than rolled back. And Scotland's got a great history of investing in worker cooperatives, social enterprises, B corporations. We need to roll that out so they are the business forms of choice. They make up a wider percentage of our economic ecosystem. We need to really give the things like the business pledge much more teeth. We need to lean on with much more rigor things like the sustainable procurement duty and participatory budgeting through the Community Empowerment Act. There are the tentative steps there there's, you know, there is a little bit of the infrastructure of the sort of changes we need. They are just way too timid right now. And so I'm often saying that Scotland is awake to these challenges, but she's still hiding under the covers. What we need is Scotland to get out of bed and run forward with making these sorts of changes, because they will eventually add up to the sort of economic shift that's required.
Brilliant. There's so much that I could go into, and I'd love to really unpick with you, Katherine. I'm aware that we're, you know, coming into the last 10 minutes now, and there's other questions. One of them is around stigma and the way in which stigma can affect maybe the ability or the willingness of Scotland to really get out from underneath the covers and address some of these bigger issues. Sabir, I wonder if you could say something about how you see as stigma as holding people sometimes in poverty, or being another barrier for people.
I think the main barrier that we see in policy formation or changing policy or a process of social change and social renewal is that we all get excited. But when that policy gets to a point which would put a rich person or a business at a financial detriment, then we shy away. So I think change happens, the excitement builds. But then when it gets to that stage where it risks someone, then we don't do much about it. So one thing I do see there is that there is, I know it was pointed out earlier by other colleagues as well, is that there is a grave danger in measuring our success as a society in economic terms, simply because we believe economy is measurable rather than because it is right. We must campaign for a well-being economy, as pointed by Mary, where we don't only measure the GDP, but we measure the well-being and how we treat the most situationally vulnerable and marginalized within our society. I think there are a range of policy solutions here, and I think one thing we don't need for sure is more surveys or more research happening. I think what we need is actions at legislative level, and I think clearly it came across from today's conversation: equal distribution of wealth, and a universal basic income for everyone, so that people have that resilience and that they have the dignified income and support to support themselves. So if we consider the asylum support system, again, and also the welfare system, which again is not a genuine social security as such, arguably, because if you take into account the no recourse to public funds and the grossly disproportionate sanctions associated with our overall benefit system, that there are deep-rooted inequalities that we need to continue to highlight and bring to the attention of executives and governments. So questions like, is it okay that 3,000 people in the most deprived areas and most deprived situations across the UK are now, from October to Christmas, are being evicted into homelessness and destitution by the Home Office? And that is what the Home Office and its three providers have agreed to do. Is that not state violence? If it is not, what is it then? So we need to look at, I know there is a spectrum of poverty. We talk about digital inclusion, we talk about other forms of financial inclusion, we talk about food poverty, low incomes and so on. But at the very sharp end of this is the population, 3,000 people being made homeless whilst the pandemic is still with us and is sadly accelerating as well. So I think the stigma and the kind of like the lack of trust, all of this boils down from that, because sadly the way we treat certain groups or communities and others, it's undermining trust in authority, trust in our policies, and also trust in how we come out of this together.
Okay, thank you. Julia, just a final question before we go to the last points, but something that's also coming up is about leadership and how we take some of these really horrendous situations and use good leadership in this crisis to move forward and actually make the change that is possible within Scotland specifically, because people have talked a lot about some of this is in Westminster, but some of it is very much in the power of Scotland to change. How do we use leadership to really drive that forward?
I do think Scotland's different from the rest of the UK. I think you've had a level of leadership that has communicated clearly. But it's absolutely clear that across the UK, the management of the pandemic has been, to be polite, suboptimal. We've done worse than most countries in the world in all parts of the UK. So I think you've had a form of political leadership that has been more far-sighted, more open, better communication, but actually some of the results are also pretty poor, and we need to be clear about that. I want to link leadership back to these two questions of austerity and stigma, because there's no doubt that because of 10 years of austerity, we went into this pandemic in a very weakened state. But to justify that austerity, we've had 10 years of stigmatizing poor people. Now, I'm with Sabir on this. I mean, I think that appalling treatment of asylum seekers is a grotesque public policy issue. But it's true about people, 20% of the population are treated as if they are worthless because they don't earn so much. The threat of destitution is a daily issue because that's what the sanctions regime offers. That was all done in order to make 10 years of austerity possible and politically palatable. And if we're going to face that, we need the sort of leadership that can speak up about the huge risk to our country of any further austerity. If we have further cuts, all of the things that we think should come out of the pandemic will not just not happen, they will be reversed, and we will end up in a politically deeply divided place. So I think leadership happens locally. I think there's leadership in every anchor institution. Every single decision it makes determines the wealth in that community. And I think there's leadership at political level. But I think civil society has got to marshal itself in the way that the Poverty Alliance is doing, to say we are a voice. We have differences, different priorities, different issues. We come at this stuff differently, because of course we do. We will start from different perspectives, but let's not magnify the differences. Let's actually understand that there is a route out of this crisis, which will be protecting people's dignity, enabling people to flourish and allowing some form of economic recovery, which without it, we will not have, and then we will be a really dangerous country.
Thanks, Julia. It seems like a nice place in which to wrap that up. I mean, we are facing an incredibly challenging winter. Some of the challenges that lie ahead that Sabir was laying out there for thousands of people who could be made homeless. We've got, all sorts of communities who are going to really be in very difficult positions this winter. I would like to really, I suppose, offer a little bit of light in the dark that our panelists could perhaps send us off with before we leave this. And I know that Mary has to go, but hang on too. So I wonder if we could just go to you first, Mary, and see if there's a little bit of hope that you have in terms of the changes that we could come through the other end of this with intact.
Yeah, thanks, Karin, because I guess the other interesting phenomenon we also have coming up this winter is Brexit and our departure from the EU, the rules and the transition period on the 31st of December, which adds a whole level of uncertainty and challenge for everyone. But I mean, in terms of hope, I think I'll go back to the point around how we have seen key workers, low-paid key workers, in a new light. And I'm not saying we've held on to that in its entirety, but I think we need to embrace that again and actually realise who it is that are providing the essential core services we all need. That keep us alive, that look after our parents, that look after our children, and how they were so fundamental to our economic and social well-being and survival. So, that sense of community that we saw at the start of the pandemic. I'm sure as the cases increase and hospital admissions around COVID increase, we'll get again that sense of the fundamental importance of those key workers who need to be rewarded appropriately. So thank you. It's been good to be here. Thanks
very much, Mary. It's a great point. Sabir, despite all of what you're facing, are there any things that you hold on to as something that could be more positive out of this?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of compassion and diversity and vibrance within the sector. I think that is important. We also have some really important initiatives by the Scottish Government, such as the Social Renewal Advisory Board. Quite a lot of work is happening there as well. But what we need ultimately, Karin, is we need ecological diversity of organisations and individuals, from lifty lawyers to do-gooders and to communities and businesses, to establish relationships of trust, not only to work together, but work shoulder to shoulder to eradicate this structural violence that is called poverty.
Fantastic, thank you, Sabir. Julia, what can the do-gooders do together?
Oh, I think we should be proud of being do-gooders and activist lawyers and all of those insults. I think we should start wearing it as a badge, because what's the opposite of being a do-gooder, doing bad? I think the most hopeful thing is the levels of solidarity shown. And it can be called mutual aid, or it can be called charity, or it can be called fundraising. But actually, when people are up against it, they showed enormous social solidarity. And that is the backbone of what we are, and that was the people who were stigmatized, that was people who are often described as wastrels and all of that. We actually did show it. Now I think the curve of the pandemic and the crisis may have weakened that and turned people against each other more, and that's the risk. But actually we need to remember quite how much was mobilized very locally at churches and mosques and gurdwaras, and all sorts of people did stuff. We're often told that that wouldn't happen, and it did happen, and that needs to be protected and promoted.
Fantastic, thank you. And Katherine?
So I talk all the time about the need for economic system change, which is an enormous project that requires shifts at all levels of the economy and throughout politics and our whole policy regime and our very purpose of what the economy is about. But why I think that is possible, despite all the challenges, why I think that enormous project is tangible and is feasible, is because there are so many amazing projects already out there rolling up their sleeves and delivering economic system change, maybe in microcosm, in their communities, in their business now. These are these pioneers that show us what a different way of doing the economy looks like. And they're going against the headwinds. They exist despite rather than because of the wider system. But what they do is they also prove that there is no excuse. Doing things differently is possible. It's not a step into the unknown, because we see it in these amazing communities, incredible businesses that are really starting to put the idea of social justice on a healthy planet at the heart of everything they do. So we know what it is because it's already out there. It's just not big enough yet. And that's the task, I think, now, is to really learn from those pioneering activities and make that the way we do the economy writ large.
Fantastic, and what a task to leave us with. I'd just really like to thank all of the panellists, Julia Unwin, Katherine Trebeck, Mary Senior and Sabir Zazai, for such a lot of food for thought during this session, and to thank all of you as well for all the interesting comments that I've been trying to follow on the chats, and I'm looking forward to just going in there and reading them in more depth. It's been a really interesting conversation that I think we could have for several hours. But yeah, thanks again. And I don't know if I'm passing over to Peter now. Is that for you?
You're passing back to me. I had planned to do a summary, but how do you summarize that? Thank you, all of our speakers. I think that was the question time we all want to see, isn't it? That was kind of what I felt anyway. I mean, I think it's too hard to try and summarize that discussion and to summarize what's gone on during Challenge Poverty Week. Challenge Poverty Week, I should say, isn't over, doesn't finish till Sunday. But what we have seen during that week is literally hundreds of examples of that solidarity and of that compassion that all of our speakers have talked about. We've seen an expression of those values over and over again. But I think the other thing that Challenge Poverty Week is so important for is it's bringing ideas for action out as well. It's not a hand-wringing discussion of a bunch of do-gooders who don't know what to do. All of the discussions that I've heard this week, and I know all the hundreds of others that have gone on where I haven't been involved, are about what are the things that we can practically do, whether it's about tackling stigma, whether it's about better local transport systems, whether it's around participatory budgeting, or the way we use our social security system. These are all ideas of practical change, of systems change that we can make happen now. And so I think, along with our speakers, I would like us to end this event on a message of hope, on a note of hope that, yes, we do face really incredible challenges ahead of us, and we should not be kidding ourselves that we don't. Even the change in universal credit that we talked about has been a small scale improvement in the system, which it was. It was one of the biggest improvements we'd seen for decades, and it's shortly going to be taken away from us. Those are the kind of changes that we see that we have in front of us. We really must come together to meet these challenges head on. And I think that's what we've tried to do during Challenge Poverty Week. And I think we've laid the basis again for the kind of response to any potential threat of future austerity, to further attacks and stigmatization on people who are seeking refuge, or people who are living in low-income communities. I think our work together over this last week extends throughout the other 52 weeks of the year, and I think that's important to remember. So over those next 51 weeks of next year, I should say, we will continue to work together. We will continue to make the case for pre-distribution, for a different kind of economy, for redesigning our social security system. And I just want to thank, again, all of our speakers here today, but the hundreds of organisations that have been involved in Challenge Poverty Week this year. We will be posting as many things about the week as we possibly can over the remaining few days. We'll be following up with as many of the organisations as we possibly can, and we'll be taking this fight forward. One final thing I should do is thank my colleagues who have worked on this campaign and the build up to this week, to Susie, to Francis and to Neil, and also to Sinead, who's dug me out of a few IT holes this week. Thank you, all of you. And again, just thank you to Karin and to all of our speakers this afternoon for a wonderful way to finish this conference. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and stay safe.